to your MSC. I am delighted to be here and to have a conversation with the former U.S. Secretary of State under Bill Clinton, Madeleine Albright. And Madeleine Albright was actually the first female Secretary of State in the U.S. And it is a pleasure to have you here. It's an honor to have a conversation with you.
This interview was strange. It was very strange. Many of the younger people may not necessarily know who Madeleine Albright is. She is within my political memory. I was around when Bill Clinton was fouling the White House. And Madeleine Albright was the person who was in charge. Now, if you remember, George Bush, despite winning the Iraq War, loses the presidency. Ross Perot gets a thank you card from Bill Clinton on that one. Bill Clinton gets in and he has to deal with certain foreign policy issues. One of these things has to do with Iraq. Lefties, and even before we get to the lefties thing, this channel has made an argument that in many respects, that what we call a two-party system is ultimately the same party. We've been tricked into this notion of a two-party system as if they're actually two parties arguing for two different ideas and perspectives of the world. They, for all intents and purposes, are two wings of the same bird. Just because there's a gradation between the two, we've become normalized to this notion of having two parties and having this distance between these two parties. But just because there are distance or gradations in the way that they talk about, meaning one may be a little bit more moderate than the other, does that really give a different framing of the world that gives the public a choice in regards to what the public wants? I would argue no. Whatever the two parties used to be, what they are now are for all intents and purposes captured by corporate interests. The parties look at the world and for all intents and purposes the same way, which is various gradations in intensity. Obama calls Venezuela a national security risk. Trump tries to take down Venezuela. Bill Clinton, and before we even go to that one, Obama puts in a light Muslim ban. He goes through and puts a ban through certain countries. Trump gets in office, makes that worse. People call it a Muslim ban. Again, similar view of the world. Even in this notion of the Yemen conflict, Obama, or better yet, the Russian thing with the Ukrainians, Obama works in order to topple that particular government, wouldn't give weapons, but Trump goes further in giving weapons. I mean, you can go down the list with this stuff. It's Bush puts through a tax cut, grotesque. Obama enshrines 80% of that into law. They look at the world in very similar ways, especially from the standpoints of finance, again, with gradations, and from the standpoints of foreign policy. Identity is the issue that they fight over. Meaning, the moment that you have a corporate capture of the system itself, the identity thing becomes the fight that the two parties have, putting economics to some degree to bed. Again, there are gradations on that stuff, but ultimately they look at the world in similar ways. This is a trap. I mean, ultimately, if I am right, and ultimately these parties are for the most part controlled by the same factor, just giving you kind of two football options, then when Bill Clinton looks and says you have nowhere else to go, he's saying that from the standpoint of a class. I hope you understand that. That's not just him saying it from the standpoint of the Democratic Party. He's saying it from the standpoint of a class that is captured. You're a political structure. It props it up. Money flows through it. The candidates who are chosen, the candidates who money is used against, the political campaigns, the dark money that flows into the pockets of these various people. Money flows through your political system. It is captured by a very particular class. If it means anything to be a lefty, and I don't like the terms that we use because the terms have various contrasts, but at the very least, in general terms of this notion of being progressive, it tends to have a certain perspective of the world that is generally against this kind of interventionist foreign policy, this knocking over of this government or that government. And even on domestic policy, from the standpoint of not having finance as being the highest objective, even at the expense of just regular people who prop up the system in and of itself. Meaning without us, there is no world or system. Anna is on a network the Young Turks that calls itself the home of the progressives. Fair enough. You use the label. Fair enough. And she has the opportunity to speak to Madeleine Albright. Just as a reminder of who Madeleine Albright is, Madeleine Albright put through, working with Bill Clinton, sanctions on Iraq. This was before George W. Bush gets in. The one that goes in and actually whacks and takes down the government of Iraq. But again, this goes back to my point. Similar perspective of the world, just gradations in it, just modest, without giving the public an actual option in regards to something else. Albright, and those sanctions in Iraq, sanctions are an act of war, ends up killing 500,000 kids, 500,000 kids. That's not even the adults. That's just children. She's confronted with this. Listen to her answer when she's asked, was it worth it? Were those sanctions that you and Bill Clinton put through that was directly responsible for the deaths of 500,000 children, was it worth it?
That 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
Yeah, it's worth it. Madeleine Albright says, absolutely. The price, 500,000 kids dying. Totally worth it. You're a lefty, and you get to have a conversation with somebody with this particular worldview. What do you say? What do you say? What do you ask? What are the things that come out of your mouth from your perspective, your general perspective of the world coming from the standpoint of a lefty? I'm not into these interventionist foreign wars. I don't like the fact that the Yemen kids are over there starving because of our intervention working with Saudi Arabia. Not to mention Obama greenlighting that war. What are the things that you think you would ask? And at the very least, if nothing else, what's the one question that you think will come up? Was it really worth it? Is 500,000 kids dying really worth it? You know what question doesn't come up? That one. Instead, you have this glowing support of this woman who has blood, rivers of blood on her hands. Glowing support. And dancing around in this weird Orwellian way where you act as if the United States is freedom and justice and that the problem started with Trump. There's a point in the interview where she even brings up anti-war, saying, yeah, I mean, part of Trump's base seems to be motivated by the Iraq war and the problems associated with the Iraq war, meaning us knocking over a government. Now, the catch here is, though, that our intervention into Iraq went before that. And you would think that if you're bringing up the Iraq war, you would also bring up the things that took place before the Iraq war, meaning the decimation of the population by Albright herself. Even when the question comes up of Yemen, and there's this weird irony that Obama greenlit that Yemen war, and Trump working with the Saudis in order to make that crime takes place. This woman was responsible for something on a similar scale. This is ludicrous. Now, understand you might not be on the TYT network, but at calling yourself a lefty, a progressive, looks like the question would have been, Madeleine Albright, you said this. You said the death of 500,000 kids were worth whatever you were trying to accomplish. She probably would say, yes, I think 500,000 kids dying in the hospitals are perfectly worth whatever I was trying to accomplish. Were you able to accomplish those objectives? Yay or nay? If you were able to accomplish those objectives, why on earth did we end up invading the country? Meaning, whatever you were trying to accomplish in that, it only got worse. Whatever you were trying to accomplish, 500,000 kids died. And I would put to you that Saddam was still there. The government was still in place. You didn't get what you wanted. 500,000 kids died for you to fail in your objectives. How does that not come up? And how does that not come up even in the context of you talking about Yemen and the comparisons between the sanctions that she was responsible for that wiped all of those people off the face of this earth, babies, and the crime that is taking place right now with Yemen, working with the with Saudis with our assistance? It's the elephant in the room. And it's the elephant in the room that gets completely danced around. This interview is a betrayal. I'm sorry, this interview is an outright betrayal. You should not be lavishing praise on this woman. And I understand you may say she's the first woman to get this particular position. Fair enough. And whatever you want to talk about in this interview, it looks, at the very least, questioning her on this notion of it being a price worth paying to wipe 500,000 kids off the earth for something you ultimately failed in. How can that not come up? How can that not come up? I'll leave it here. I'm not going to keep this one long because there's another video that's up that I really want to get to dealing with Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris is no longer in this presidential race. I'll talk about that on the next video. Like, share,